The definition of a premonition is a previous notice or warning, or the anticipation of an event without conscious reason. I'm sharing with you 3 major premonitions that I've had which have convinced me that there is indeed a God who watches over us and protects us. I even believe that guardian angels have helped me prepare for devastating situations. My first premonition happened when I was 16. I was sitting in a typing class full of about 25 students who could not have been described as the most engaged students on the planet. In fact, sports was their favorite subject. The typing class's teacher, whom I'll call Miss Smith, had noticed something fishy while she was grading several of the students' typing assignments, which they had printed out on the classroom's really cool new laser printer. Did I mention that this was about 2 decades ago? One student had printed off several copies of her work and then let her friends turn in the extra copies as their own. In other words, they cheated. Miss Smith was furious as she stood in the front of the classroom and scolded my typing class's cheaters for their dishonest behavior. While she had wanted to give the offenders a detention, she told us that she would try to save them the humiliation of being punished by letting them come in early the next morning to do some extra homework. The following morning came and passed, yet many of the cheaters refused to report to their special punishment. Later that day, Miss Smith exploded and berated the academic offenders who hadn't shown up that morning. She then announced that she was going to have the athletic offenders suspended from the football playoff schedule for the following week. A stunned silence fell over the classroom as the jocks let this sink in. No football after all those rough and tough practices? No way. A strange feeling came over me, and for reasons which I'll never be able to explain, I reached into my book bag and pulled out a pen and a notebook. I didn't know why I needed to do this, yet I did it. Miss Smith was quiet as she studied us for a moment. Then she said that she had decided that she was going to let us express our opinions about the matter. That's when she told us to get out a notebook or a sheet of paper so that we could anonymously write down our opinions so that she could read them and make her final decision. I sat there numb with shock. How did I know that she was going to ask us to pull out our notebooks? In fact, I had never needed to use a notebook in that typing class, since everything was done on the brand spanking new Macintoshes in the classroom. I wrote down my opinion, which was that the offender should get an after-school detention, and if they attend those detentions, then they should be able to participate in the playoffs. What's even creepier, that turned out to be Miss Smith's decision. It made no sense that I was able to predict the sequence of events. I think that all of the stress that I was going through in high school, I had tapped into something that let me know things that would happen in the future. My next premonition happened about 9 years later. I had just started my current retail job, so I only barely knew the rest of the staff there. I was working as a cashier one night when a charming man came through my line and bought a couple of things. He smiled at me, and we chatted for a minute before he asked about a woman, whom I'll call Ann Jones. By the way, he asked, do you know if Aunt Jones is working tonight? I had seen Ann several times over the last few weeks, and I knew that she was working that night. I opened my mouth to tell him that she was working in the health and beauty section, but my entire body went stiff as what I can only describe as a screaming thought raced through my mind. Don't tell him she's here! No! Don't let him know that Ann is here, the thought commanded me. I struggled to breathe for a minute, but then my body relaxed as I politely told him that I was new with the company. I told him that I wasn't familiar with Ann, which was the truth at the time, but I could ask a manager if she was there. He smiled and told me that he would catch up with her later. I'll call him Emmett. I'll tell her that Emmett said fine, he said. He turned and sauntered out of the store. I asked a friend of Ann's to tell her that Emmett had been there to visit Ann, but he had left. The friend gasped, and she hurried to Anne and passed on the message. Within seconds, Anne raced towards me and demanded to know what time he had been there. I told her an approximate time, and Anne, pale as a ghost, ran to a manager to speak with her in private. A few minutes later, they both returned to me and asked me a few more questions as they waited for a police officer to arrive. As soon as the cop showed up, they headed back to the manager's office. I knew then that something horrible had happened, but I didn't want to be nosy. Later on that shift, Anne explained that Emmett had violated his restraining order by going to her workplace and trying to contact her. I was shaken by this as I told her that I had been swayed by his charming personality. He hadn't seemed like a threat. Anne shook her head. "Lady," she said, "he only acts charming when he wants to manipulate people. Believe me, you don't want to see his true colors." I told Anne about my screaming thought. I explained that my instincts had kicked in, and I was thrilled that those instincts had apparently prevented her from being harmed by Emmett. I've told others the story, and many agree with me that Anne's guardian angel was the one who ordered me not to tell Emmett that Anne was in the building. I still wonder what would have happened had Emmett found her. Was he there to threaten her? Was he there to attack her? And then there's the worst case scenario. Was Emmett there to kill her? Did he have a gun or another weapon with him? I had lived in my last apartment for nearly 6.5 years when my next premonition happened. I would describe it as an old, yet comfortable, 2-bedroom basement apartment with white walls and tan carpeting, which went well with everything. I had decided to redecorate the apartment, and I would finish it over the next week. I had always just placed white towels over my bedroom windows, so I decided that it was time to put up some fancy curtains in their place. I scanned the room as I tried to decide which color of curtains I should choose. Should I choose tan, which would match almost everything in the bedroom? Or maybe dark brown, which would create quite a contrast with the room's white walls? Then again, maybe cream would blend in with everything better. It was then that what felt like an electric current flowed through my body, and my body stiffened, just as it did with Anne's experience. What I call a strong thought invaded my mind as I stood there stiff. "Don't worry about it. You won't be here much longer," the thought told me. I frowned as my body relaxed. Well, of course I would be there until at least next spring, when I had decided I would approach my landlord about finding a new apartment. I shrugged it off as just my fatigued mind telling me that it was time to rest. A week and a half passed, yet I still hadn't bought the curtains, which I had decided would be dark brown. I went to my retail job, and I was working at a cash register when a customer in my neighborhood approached me. A torrential downpour raged outside as she asked me if I lived on her street. I explained that I lived one street over. She told me that heavy floodwaters had shut down our section of town, and that her house's basement was flooded. I gulped. After all, I lived in a basement apartment, so I feared that there would be some water damage when I got home later. The customer left, and the downpour worsened the next hour. I learned later that 4 inches of rain had fallen in about half an hour. I had considered checking out my apartment on my lunch break, but I decided there wasn't much I could do, even if there wasn't water damage. I finished my shift and drove home. I walked down the stairs to my apartment, and the first thing that I noticed was that most of the staircase and the floor was flat, that the floodwaters there must have receded. I unlocked my apartment's back door to go inside. The door unlocked, yet I had to shove the door open with my shoulder to open it. I gazed in horror at the water which gushed out through the open door and stood as still as the sun in my apartment. I took off my shoes and rolled up my jeans to go inside, but I could only make a few steps before I nearly lost my balance in the filthy water. I hurried back up the staircase and called my landlord, who was already making plans to deal with the disaster. Later on that day, a relative managed to get into the apartment to see the damage. He said that he was sickened when he saw my belongings destroyed and float into the water. I had never known that refrigerators could float. The relative allowed me to stay with him while I was looking for a new apartment. This flood had harmed most properties in my section of town. It had even nearly put a storage unit company out of business. In the description, I've added a link to footage of a hospital's cafeteria being wrecked by this same flooding. That cafeteria has since been restored, but they have limited hours to it. I believe that the floodwaters which crashed into my apartment did so exactly the way it received this weekend. I now live in a better upstairs apartment, and I think that my own guardian angel told me not to buy this curtain, since I wouldn't end up using them. Maybe she's a bargainista like me. I hope you enjoyed listening to my stories about my premonitions that I've had, and I would like to hear about your premonitions, or maybe you've known someone who's had premonitions. I've left my contact information in the description of this video, and it's also listed on the screen. And please feel free to subscribe to my new channel here. And also, if you'd like to like this video, feel free to do that as well. Thank you so much.